This presentation was created to give people a better idea of what the Strategic Planning Task Force has been working on in preparation for our January 31st, 2016 congregational meeting. The Strategic Planning Task Force was chartered by the Mission Peak Board in January of 2015. We were tasked with starting a leadership development process, revising our congregational governance structure to let the board focus more on visioning and long-term planning and to prepare for growth. And we were also tasked with coming up with a strategic plan. This presentation outlines our governance structure and leadership development plan. The Strategic Planning Task Force was made up of Colleen Arnold, Melissa Holmes, Jennifer King, Deanna Kosaraju, Marilyn Wakefield, and Steve Walcave. Some of the folks listed are no longer on the Strategic Planning Task Force, but they can all answer questions about how the information you will hear about later originally was developed. This presentation was originally given at a series of roundtable discussions in the fall of 2015. At the end of those roundtable discussions, we asked for feedback from the participants about what the Strategic Planning Task Force should do in order to move the process forward. The feedback we got was generally positive, meaning that almost everyone felt we were moving in the right direction, although there were some comments and questions about specific items within the presentation. We also asked what steps should be taken in order to give the Strategic Planning Task Force the approval to keep moving forward, whether that was informal or formal. And the recommendation from the majority of the people we talked to was that we hold a non-binding congregational vote, which we plan to do on January 31st of 2016. The non-binding vote only indicates whether people believe that we should continue with the work that the Strategic Planning Task Force is doing. As you'll see later in the presentation, we intend to have a binding vote on bylaw changes at the June 2016 congregational meeting, assuming that we can make that timeline. The upcoming meeting in January is only to indicate to the Strategic Planning Task Force whether we should continue working on this or if we have major issues with our plans that we need to address before we continue to move forward. This is the current congregational structure. The dark blue is the congregation, which oversees everything related to Mission Peak. The congregation determines the mission of Mission Peak and provides feedback about what is important to the congregation in general. The board is elected by the congregation to fulfill the mission and other goals of the congregation. The minister sits on the board, although he is not elected by the congregation. Every committee at Mission Peak is chartered by the board, and the committees report to the board through a board liaison, who is a board member who interfaces with different committees. Each board member has about 3 committees that they interface with. The board liaison provides a monthly update from each of their committees back to the board so the board knows what each committee is doing. And if information needs to go from the board to a committee, whether it's a request of the committee or just to provide the committee with additional information about something, the board liaison also does that as well. The Program Council is a meeting of all the committee chairs. It happens 3 times a year, and it's an information sharing meeting. Each of the committees talks about what they're working on, what they've got coming up in the future, whether it's events or activities that they're having or goals that they're trying to accomplish. The Program Council is not directed by the board specifically. However, the vice president of the board runs the Program Council, and board members Many of the board members attend program council meetings, so there's overlap between the board and the program council. In our current congregational governance structure, there is not a clear method for committees to help the board accomplish the goals and long-term plans of the congregation. Right now, if a suggestion or a request comes to the board members do the legwork involved with that request. For example, when CARE suggested that we get a changing table in one of the bathrooms, a board member went to the facilities committee to find out if it was feasible to do that. Another board member found out how much it would cost, and the board discussed the budget. The Strategic Planning Task Force is proposing a new or slightly modified governance structure to help support the board in making some of the more routine decisions and letting the board focus on longer term tasks and strategies to move Mission Peak forward. This is the congregational structure that the Strategic Planning Task Force is proposing. The congregation would still be the ultimate authority of what goes on at Mission Peak, still in charge of determining the mission of Mission Peak and providing feedback about what is important to the congregation that the board work on. The board is still in place, still elected by the congregation. The minister sits on the board, although he is not elected by the congregation. One of the changes that we're proposing is that instead of a program council, we split the committees into 3 different councils: the Personnel Council, the Ministry Council, and the Operations Council. These councils are organized by task functions or areas of specialty, if you will, that the committees have. The Ministry Council is the one that's most like the Program Council is today. It contains all of the committees that work on the ministry of Mission Peak. So committees like CARE and Social Justice, Worship Associates, and that kind of thing. The Personnel Council is made up of the Membership Committee and the Leadership Development Committee, which is the nominating committee reformed into to have more of a leadership development aspect to it. And the Personnel Council deals with everything relating to people at Mission Peak: the staff, the volunteers, every person who helps move Mission Peak forward. The Operations Council deals with finances and facilities. So they're made up of the Facilities Committee, what is currently the Canvas Committee, although the bylaws say that we need to have a Stewardship Committee, and everyone else who make sure that the day-to-day operation of Mission Peak is happening so that we can do our ministry. The goal or structure of the councils would change in our proposal. Our proposal would have the councils be more of a action and task-oriented entity rather than the current program council structure, which is more of a communication vehicle. So in our new proposed structure, the board will communicate with the councils about whatever the board is working on, what our strategic plan indicates that we should be working on, or the board's 1-year or 2-year goals, or whatever the board is visioning. The board communicates that information down to each of the 3 councils, and then the 3 councils determine how their membership fits into the board's plan for whatever it is they're working on, whether it's buying a building or starting new UU congregations in the greater area, opening a food kitchen, supporting a counseling center, whatever the board is working on to fulfill the mission of Mission Peak. Those items trickle down to the councils so that the councils and in turn the committees can help work towards fulfilling the mission of Mission Peak. We are also, in our proposal, creating a new entity called the executive team. The executive team is a subset of the board, and it's made up of the board president and the vice president, and a new position on the board, the past president. And the executive team is really the COO of Mission Peak. The executive team is the group that makes sure we are getting things done. They set the agendas for the board meeting and all of the council meetings. They do not determine what information is discussed at any of those meetings, but their function is to triage information and make sure that what each council and the board is talking about makes the most sense. For example, if the board has two items on the agenda. One is that the Methodists are going to be digging trenches in 2 weeks to work on gas lines. And the second one is that CARE wants to do a visioning workshop in 6 months. It's the executive team's job to make sure that the gas line issue goes on the agenda first and that gets talked about before the visioning, which is important but is not coming up quite so quickly. The executive team also figures out how best to accomplish a project or a task. So the executive team will look at items or tasks that the board wants to address and determine which of the councils have pieces of those tasks, and then take that information to each of the council meetings so that the councils can provide either feedback or get tasks done for the board, whatever it is to move the board's goals forward. The executive team also makes sure that what the board is trying to accomplish actually happens, meaning that they make sure that whatever is being worked on doesn't fall through the cracks. And their job is also to provide support for whoever is working on something so that we don't just lose something into, somebody doesn't have a family emergency and then whatever they were working on just gets dropped and no one picks it back up. The executive team makes sure that we continue to move things forward. The council meetings will happen every other month, and in our proposal, the board will meet every other month instead of every month as it does now. The reason for this is that the councils will be working on more tactical, day-to-day, and routine tasks, and letting the board focus more on visioning, longer-term items that they're working on, figuring out what are some of the goals that Mission Peak wants to accomplish and how are we going to do that. So the board will not need to meet as often. The councils will also be able to address some of the routine issues that the board deals with now. For example, anytime someone wants to sell something after the service, the board has to determine whether or not they can. So whether someone can sell Girl Scout cookies, whether a visiting minister can sell their book after the service. Tasks like that don't need to be determined, or decisions like that don't need to be made at the board level. With some written board policies, those can be made at the council level for the most part, and then if there's something that's particularly complicated, it can be forwarded to the board. But the board doesn't need to be spending the majority of its time working on decisions like that. That should be just a small part of what they do, and most of the time the board should be focusing on the future. The example that I've used previously is right now the board is looking at the speedometer and the gas gauge, trying to make sure that the car is going to keep functioning. We need to help the board look up and out the windshield at the road ahead and where we're going. This council structure will take the day-to-day issues off of the board's plate and let them focus on longer-term strategy. This has been an overview of our proposal. We have several slides that go into more detail to give you a better idea of what we are actually proposing. There are several reasons that we're proposing this new governance structure. The goals with the new governance structure are listed on the slide. One of the biggest reasons for going to this new structure is that we want the board to stop looking at the gas gauge, to look out the front window, and be able to spend more time thinking about where we're going. What does Mission Peak want to accomplish? What are the important things that will make Mission Peak a unique place and continue to be a community that we all want to foster and support and move forward? We want the board to be able to focus less on the day-to-day activities, who can sell things after the service. With board policies in place, as I said before, the councils can make some of those decisions and give the board some breathing room to determine where we're going in the longer term. The new governance structure will also increase communication and collaboration between committees. Right now, the committees meet 3 times a year to share information. With the new council structure, the committees will meet every other month and be talking about what they're trying to accomplish rather than just reporting out. This new governance structure also increases what I call accountability. And what I mean by accountability is really twofold. We need to make sure that if someone says that they're going to do something, that we help them get it done. We all have issues that come up in our lives that keep us from fulfilling tasks that we've taken on, whether it's a sick parent or a loss of a job or anything that comes up. We need to make sure that we are supporting people who are volunteering on behalf of Mission Peak, whether it's giving them assistance in figuring out how to get things accomplished, whether it's finding someone to help them if their available time has gotten much smaller. So accountability really means rather than having no one follow up to make sure that something is happening, it means that we're checking in with people to make sure that they have all of the assistance they need to get something done. Accountability also means that, for example, if we want to have a committee fair, and we come up with a great idea like that, that it doesn't take 2 years for us to accomplish it because no one's checking back in to see if we're figuring out how to have the committee fair. If we say we're going to do something, we need to follow through and get it done. The executive team has been created and put in place specifically to make sure that we follow up on what we say we're going to do and we help people and give them the support they need to accomplish what we said we were going to do. Another one of the goals of the governance structure and the leadership development, and the strategic planning task force is to initiate leadership development. We will not be successful with a new governance structure without leadership development. Specifically, the governance structure that we're proposing spreads out the decision making to more people in the congregation. Decision making will go to the councils as well as the board. The decisions that the councils make will not be as far-reaching necessarily as the decisions the board make, and will be made in conjunction with defined policy, but we still will have more leaders having an impact on where Mission Peak goes. We can't do that without having leadership development to prepare people to go into leadership roles and to support them once they're in those leadership roles. The last goal of the governance structure is to facilitate congregational goal setting. We need to put the board in a position where they can spend time working on thinking about getting feedback on congregational goals and where we want to. So far, we've talked about a high-level overview of our governance proposal, and we've also talked about why we believe that we should be changing our governance structure. Over the next series of slides, we're going to get into more detail, starting with the slide in front of you, which is a slightly more detailed overview of the process that I've talked about. So we're going to split the program council into 3 separate councils: the Personnel Council, the Ministry Council, and the Operations Council. Splitting the program council into 3 separate councils allows each individual council to focus on their specific area of expertise or area of focus, so that they can concentrate on one particular subset of Mission Peak ministry and all work together in a related way to move forward that particular piece of Mission Peak, whether it's personnel or ministry or operations. Each of the new councils is going to be a decision-making body. They will be tasked with making decisions every other month at their meetings, and they will be part of the board's vehicle for moving things forward, for fulfilling the goals of Mission Peak, for moving us down the road wherever we want to go. The councils will be one of the entities that actually gets work done to accomplish that. The councils also allow more structured interactions between individual committees. Every other month, the committees will be meeting to work together toward a specific accomplishment. And there's going to be a board member on every council in addition to the board member who chairs the council. This provides more interaction between the board and the committees, and also makes sure that there's a better understanding of what the board's goals are, and that board members are getting a better understanding of what challenges the committees are facing and how they're doing on the tasks that have been assigned to them. In our new governance proposal, we have created a new entity called the executive team. It's a subgroup of the board and is made up of the president, the vice president, and a new board position, the past president. The executive team organizes the councils and the board. They set the board and council agenda meetings. They also run all of the board and council meetings. A member of the executive team chairs each of the councils, and then because the board president is on the executive team, a member of the executive team is also running the board meetings. Their job is to make sure that we bring accountability, which I talked about before, to the council and to the board. Meaning, are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we working to address the goals and ministry of Mission Peak? Are we making sure that we are implementing what we have determined to be a priority. The executive team also triages activities and issues for the board and the councils. They specifically are not gatekeepers of information. They do not choose which information is talked about by the councils or the board. Their job is to make sure that the appropriate information is discussed at an appropriate time. They need to make sure that if there's a high priority item, it goes to the board and the board talks about it at the next board meeting. They also evaluate what was discussed at a board meeting and figure out if the councils need to discuss that same subject. Did the board talk about a particular suggestion that someone has made that they need feedback from the councils on? The executive team will have the wherewithal to identify, this came up at the board meeting and we need some specific information from a couple of the councils in order for us to move forward. The executive team is going to put that on the agenda for the council meetings and make sure that the councils discuss whatever issue came up at the board meeting that the board needs feedback on, so that the whole leadership of the congregation, not just the board, but also the committees, are working together to achieve the goals of Mission Peak. The councils each meet every other month in the month opposite of the board. So each council meets individually. The ministry council is meeting just with itself, but they all meet in the same month. So for examples, the councils will all meet in January, March, and May, and then the board meets in the opposite month. In this example, they would meet in February, April, and June. That way the board members are still attending one meeting a month, like they do now, but they're just not attending a board meeting every other month. They're attending a council meeting one month and then a board meeting the next month. Once a year, all of the councils meet together to discuss what's going on, to talk about the priorities and goals of Mission Peak, and just to make sure that everyone is aware and has the opportunity to communicate with each other. The Ministry Council is most like the current Program Council. And the goal of the Ministry Council is to develop and support all of our congregational ministries, both our internal ministries like Sunday service and small group ministry, as well as our external ministries, social justice, adult RE, those kinds of things. The members of the Ministry Council include the Social Justice Committee, Pastoral Care Committee, COM, Worship Associates, Care, Adult RE, Music, Small Group Ministry, Fellowship, as well as the minister, the community minister, a board member other than the executive team member, and the outreach coordinator. So I talked a little bit about it before. The person attending the council meeting from each of the committees does not need to be the chair. So that's why it says the members include the chair or a designee. The person attending the council meeting must have decision-making authority for the committee that they are representing. This does not mean that they're going to commit the committee to doing a 10-month class that meets every week and requires participation by all committee members, 4 hours a week for the next 10 weeks. What decision-making authority means is that the person representing a particular committee has the authority to make a commitment to the council that either the committee can accomplish something, the committee that they can take an issue or a question or a point of concern back to the committee and ensure that the committee discusses it at the next meeting. They also, decision-making authority means that they can sign the committee up to providing information back to the council at the next council meeting. It does not mean that they're going to sign the committee up for something that's completely impossible for the committee to do. I do want to say, as we go through the 3 separate councils and you see the members for each of the councils, all of the committees who are listed as members of the councils currently exist. Some of them have different names, so some of them do not exist in the same form that we are envisioning, but there is only one additional committee other than what we have in place right now. And that committee is the Fellowship Committee, which currently does not exist, but we would like to implement that as part of the whole governance structure reorganization. The Fellowship Committee would be a group of folks who plan events. The Fellowship Committee is going to be in charge of the annual camping trip. They're going to be in charge of the annual baseball Sunday. They're going to be in charge of singing Christmas carols at the Christmas holidays. They're going to be in charge of potlucks. They're going to be in charge of, at some level, morale within the congregation and making sure that we take the time just to socialize with each other and enjoy each other's company. The Fellowship Committee is also going to be a resource for other committees. If your committee wants to hold an event, for whatever reason, you can go to the Fellowship Committee and they can tell you this is the best way to book a hall, and if you want to serve alcohol, you cannot use Cole Hall, and this is how you get babysitters, and this is the best way to run a potluck if you want to have a potluck. And just give other committees assistance in holding an event so that each committee is not reinventing the process every time. So the Ministry Council is chaired by a member of the executive team. We have not specified which executive team member will chair each council. We wanted that to be a decision made by the executive team based on experience and interest. The Ministry Council meets every other month, as we discussed before. It's the month opposite of the board meeting, and the minutes of the Ministry Council are published. We currently envision that the minutes would be published in their entirety on the website, but that 1 or 2 or 3 of the most interesting or most timely topics would be posted in Week on the Peak so that everyone could get a really quick snapshot of what was talked about at that council meetings. This council is the one that's most like the program council, but rather than reporting out to each other what each committee is doing, the council is going to be working on tasks that they have been directed to work on by the board. Really, they're going to work on the goals of the congregation as interpreted and organized by the board. That doesn't mean that they can't work on something on their own. The Ministry Council could decide to have a committee fair, and that's something that they're going to work on and probably ask for board assistance with. But so they can pass tasks and ideas upward to the board, but they also are responsible to the board when the board asks them to do something. The Operations Council supports the physical and financial needs of the congregation. They work on facilities and money. The members of the Operations Council include the chair or designee of the Facilities Committee, Denominational Affairs, the Canvas Committee or Stewardship Committee or Finance Committee. We don't know what it will eventually be called. However, the bylaws do indicate that we need to have a Stewardship Committee. The Operations Council will also include the Methodist Liaison, someone from Sunday Services, and the Treasurer. For the other 2 councils, we have not specified who the additional board member is, but for the Operations Council, we have specified that it be the Treasurer because this is the Money Council. I just wanted to add one more note about Sunday services on the Operations Council. We're not talking about worship. We're talking about buying coffee, making sure that we have enough plates, the nuts and bolts execution of Sunday services will be in the Operations Council, because that's a day-to-day, do we have enough physical material to make worship service happen or comfortable for people. It'll happen without it, but we would like to have the coffee and the snacks. The Operations Council is chaired by a member of the executive team. They meet every other month, same month as the Ministry Council, opposite month from the board, and the minutes of their meetings are published. Again, the entirety of the minutes will be published on the website, with a few highlights put in week on the peak so that it's easy for everyone to find out kind of what the most important topics were that they talked about at that meeting. The Personnel Council supports the work of the staff, the volunteers, and the ministers at Mission Peak. They really support the people at Mission Peak. Their goal is to help everyone at Mission Peak develop their gifts and strengths, and also to provide a way for everyone to be involved in congregational life at Mission Peak, to make sure that if you want to volunteer in support of Mission Peak, you have a way to do that. They also make sure that we're doing the required nominations of the board members and any other committee chairs who are required to be nominated for a vote in the bylaws. They do this through the Leadership Development Committee, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The members of the Personnel Council include the Membership Committee and the Leadership Development Committee, as well as the minister, the community minister, a board member in addition to the executive team member, the outreach coordinator, the office administrator, and any other staff is designated by the executive team. So let me go back and say a couple of things about the members on the Personnel Council. The Leadership Development Committee is going to take the place of the Nominating Committee, assuming that everything proceeds forward as we are recommending. So the Leadership Development Committee will nominate everybody for the elections, the yearly elections. They will also work on doing a variety of different kinds of leadership development, and that's outlined in a later slide. Also, as far as the staff who attend Personnel Council meetings, there are some staff who don't need to attend. For example, Eric, the pianist, does not need to attend every Personnel Council meeting. However, he may attend once a year when we're talking about if we have a specific theme for the year, we want to let him know about that, or if we need his input about something, he may be asked to attend the meetings. The Personnel Council is chaired by a member of the executive team. They meet every other month, like the other councils, in opposite months from the board meeting, and the minutes of their meeting are published. Again, the full text of the minutes will be on the website, and then kind of a teaser about what got talked about, or just a brief highlight of what was talked about, will be on Week on the Peak. The executive team is a new subgroup of the board that this governance structure creates. It's made up of the president, the vice president, and the past president, and the minister is an ex officio member, an ad hoc member who may participate as much or as little as they would like. So the goal of the executive team is to make sure that all of the councils and the board are working together to implement the goals of Mission Peak. The executive team creates the agendas for all of the council meetings and the board meetings, and they facilitate communication between the councils and the board. They are making sure that if something comes up at one council meeting that needs to be discussed by another council or the board, that the information gets disseminated back to the board or to the other council meeting, and that it goes on the agenda, and there is the needed discussion. So like I outlined the members before, it's the president, the vice president, and the past president. The executive team meets every month. They're meeting, they're running the council meetings, they're meeting in that month, and then they are attending the board meetings in the opposite month. The executive team is the only group who may end up meeting more than once a month. Right now, the board president talks to the minister about board meeting agendas every month. The executive team is going to have a meeting every month to discuss agendas before or in preparation for the council and board meetings. This does not necessarily have to be a formal meeting where everybody gets together. It can be via email, it can be over the phone, it can be whatever works best for the executive team. So the minutes of the executive team meetings will be the agendas of the board and council meetings. This is the outline of our proposed governance structure. We talked about it before, but I wanted to show it to you again now that you've had a little more explanation of what the proposal entails so that you can see it in a visual format. The congregation, the dark blue, is really in charge of everything related to Mission Peak. The goals and vision and mission of the congregation is implemented by the board, and the minister sits on the board. In our new proposal, a subgroup of the board called the executive team takes information from the board and from council meetings and integrates it into the goals of Mission Peak. The executive team also runs each of the council meetings. They come up with agendas for the council meeting and the board meeting, and they provide the accountability that we've talked about before. The executive team is making sure that whatever the task, whatever the topic, we're seeing it through to completion. Completion may not mean that we're actually doing it. What completion means is that we have explored the idea, we've discussed all of the possibilities, requirements, pros, cons, and we've worked through all of the issues till we decide, yes, we're going to do this, and then the executive team would continue to follow up and make sure that we planned what we were going to do and followed through and implemented our plan. Or if we get through the preliminary discussion and decide this is not really something we want to do, we're going to table it for now. The executive team makes sure that everything happens until we get to the point where we say, we've talked through the idea, we understand all of the ramifications, but this is not the right time. The program council is divided into 3 new councils: the personnel council, the ministry council, and the operations council. A member of the executive team chairs each of the councils and acts as a communication vehicle between the councils and the board. Each council is made up of committees that fit within the specific tasking of the council. So each council is working on a specific facet of Mission Peak. For example, the Personnel Council works on all things related to people, related to volunteers, and related to staff. The councils meet in opposite months as the board. So, for example, all 3 councils will have separate meetings, but will meet in the same month. For example, January, March, and May, and the board will meet in the opposite months, February, April, and June. The councils are different from the program council in that they are decision-making and action-taking entities. The board is looking at the longer-term vision and goals and ministry of Mission Peak, and then engaging the councils and the committees within the councils to help accomplish these longer-term goals and visions. Now that you've had an overview of our governance proposal, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Leadership Development Committee, which would be a replacement for the nominating committee. The Strategic Planning Task Force has developed a draft charter for the Leadership Development Committee, and we are proposing that this get put in place regardless of what happens around the governance structure and whatever the final outcome of that is. Our proposal for the Leadership Development Committee is really a committee that has 3 areas of responsibility. The first one is to provide leadership training for everyone in Mission Peak who is interested. The Leadership Development Committee would work with adult RE and potentially care to develop a series of classes that became available on a routine basis that all related to leadership development in some way, and then to also provide training from entities outside of Mission Peak for leadership development. These could be classes at the PCD, classes from the UUA, these could be classes from local community colleges, they could be classes taught by people in the congregation who have expertise in leadership development. But one of the main focuses of the Leadership Development Committee is to have appropriate training for all members of the congregation who want to improve their leadership skills. The second part of the Leadership Development Committee's responsibilities is to provide a process that moves people through leadership opportunities within Mission Peak and moves them through volunteer opportunities at Mission Peak. What I mean by this is there are people in the congregation who would really like to volunteer and really like to do more to help Mission Peak, but they are not sure how to do that. The Leadership Development Committee will create a process where we're helping people find their way into volunteer activities. For example, I've been coming to Mission Peak for a couple of months. I'm interested. I seem to be continuing. And someone from the Leadership Development Committee talks to me about starting to volunteer at Mission Peak. Is that something I'd be interested in? There are several ways to kind of get your feet wet in terms of volunteering. You could do setup once a month. You could bring goodies once a month. You could be an RE teacher. And I agree to do one or more of those things. Then I've been coming to Mission Peak for a year, possibly, and someone comes back to me again and says, you've been with us for a year, you've been doing some volunteering, helping with doing coffee hour, you've taught some RE classes. Would you like to be involved in any of our committees? Is there something that interests you? I'll give you a list of the committees, tell you, and I can give you some information about what they're currently working on and what their typical meeting schedule is to help you see if there's anything you're interested in. And I end up being on the Social Justice Committee. Then a year or two later, the Leadership Development Committee comes back to me and says, you've been attending Mission Peak for several years now. You've been on the Social Justice Committee for a few years. We're looking for someone who can replace the current chair of the Social Justice Committee whenever she's ready to take on a new challenge. Would you be interested in doing that? And before you decide, we want to let you know that we have leadership training that we can give you to help you do that. We'd also set up some time where you could have one-on-one discussions with the current chair to get a better idea of what the chair does. And I decide I'm really interested in doing that because there's someone who's going to help me through the process and help me get prepared for that. So 2 years later, the chair of the Social Justice Committee has in fact decided that she is ready to do something different, and I step into the role because I've had a chance to be prepared for it. Then, a year or two later, the Leadership Development Committee comes back to me and says, "You've been doing lots of volunteering for Mission Peak for several years now. You really are really good at getting people to work with you, and you really have a great understanding of how Mission Peak works. Are you interested in being on the board? This is what the commitment is. This is what typical board meetings are like. This is what the overall board strategy looks like. We have some additional leadership classes, and we think that we could, over the next year, help you get prepared to be a board member." And I say yes because it's something I'm interested in, and again, I am not being thrown into it, but I have a chance to prepare myself for it. And then 2 years later, they come to me and say, "Would you like to be president of the board?" And we have ways to help prepare you for that. So that's the second overall goal of the Leadership Development Committee, to go to people and help them find a volunteer opportunity that fits for them. And rather than have them look around on their own to try and figure out what they want to do, help them with that process. The third general tasking of the Leadership Development Committee is to do succession planning. And the first two items, leadership development and moving people through different volunteer opportunities, naturally lead to the succession planning. What we want to do is, for all key leadership positions, whether it's a board member or whether it's a committee chair or whether it's everybody on the nominating committee, everyone on the leadership development committee, whatever position it happens to be, we want to be prepared with people who are ready, willing, and able to serve in that position. We don't want committee chairs to have to find their own replacement. We want someone who's waiting in the wings to take over whenever a committee chair is ready to move on to something else. And the Leadership Development Committee will help prepare people to do that. The Leadership Development Committee will include all of the nominating committee functions, and it replaces the nominating committee. So we are creating a new committee, but we're not adding a committee. We're replacing a committee. The Leadership Development Committee will nominate people to be on the board and in all positions that require nomination in the bylaws. And the committee is going to be made up of 6 elected members. Each of them will have a 3-year term. So that means that 2 people will be elected every year. That means that we always have people with experience on the Leadership Development Committee, and we have fresh blood coming in every year to learn the ropes, who will eventually be the seasoned folks who will shepherd in the new people. The minutes of every meeting are going to be published, just like we've talked about with the council meetings. The entire text of the meeting will be published on the web with just a couple highlights on Week on the Peak so everyone can tell what has been talked about. So we have talked about a lot of information, our proposed governance structure changes, as well as the Leadership Development Committee. This is our timeline. And let me just say, you can have an aggressive timeline. And if you have a really aggressive timeline and it's not working, you can back it off a little bit and just make it so that it takes a little bit longer to accomplish what you wanted to get done. If you have a really laid back timeline that's fairly stretched out, you cannot move that forward. You can only stretch it out more. So the timeline that I'm about to talk you through is aggressive. We wanted to come up with the fastest timeline that we thought possible, knowing that if we were not able to make all of the milestones on the timeline, we could push it back a little bit. So just keep that in mind. So in the fall of 2015, we had roundtable discussions with the congregation about our governance and leadership development proposals. On January 31st, 2016, we are going to have a non-binding congregational meeting for the Strategic Planning Task Force to get approval from the congregation to proceed. This is not a binding vote. This does not lock anyone into what's been described here. What it does do is indicate to the Strategic Planning Task Force whether we're on the right track or whether we are not on the right track and we need to make some significant changes to our proposal in order for it to meet the needs of Mission Peak. In June of 2016, there will be an official vote on bylaw changes at the annual meeting. That's the vote when we're either going for it or we're not going for it. So the January 31st vote is really to let us know, are we in the right ballpark, and also to make sure that the members of Mission Peak know that there are changes coming. And they have an initial opportunity to weigh in and say, yes, this looks good, or no, I have concerns, knowing that they'll have one more opportunity for a vote. And that also gives people time to start thinking about the official vote and what questions do I have and what questions can get answered before that vote in June. Assuming that the vote in June passes, where we do change the bylaws to implement the Leadership Development Committee and the new governance structure, in July of 2016, the Leadership Development Committee and the executive team are going to start in their new roles. We are planning on a year-long transition to fully get into the new structure. So July, we take the first step where we get folks into new roles. In the fall of 2016, the Program Council starts the transition into 3 separate councils. We don't know exactly what that transition looks like right now, but I envision that it would be something like the first meeting in October of 2016. It would be a traditional Program Council meeting with possibly dividing into the 3 different councils for a part of the meeting to start discussing how the councils would operate. With a transition to the last council meeting in April of 2017, then the program council is going to be split into its 3 separate councils, and they will really be starting to work on supporting the board, taking action to help the board fulfill the goals of Mission Peak. So in June 2017, our plan right now is that we will be completely transitioned to our new governance structure and that everything will be complete in that area. The newly elected board members and committee members will be elected knowing that their terms are commensurate with what is indicated in the governance structure. Basically, that the board vice president will have a 3-year term and be expected to go on to be the president and the past president. And that in the Leadership Development Committee, they will be signing on for 3-year terms. In July of 2017, when we are fully into the new congregational structure, we are going to begin work on the strategic plan. This is the end of the Strategic Planning Task Force presentation. We are asking that you come to the January 31st congregational meeting and give us your vote, even though it's an unofficial or non-binding congregational meeting. We still want to have as many congregation members as possible give us their input about whether or not we are going down the right road or if we need to make significant changes. If you have questions about any of the information that you've seen or heard during this presentation, you can contact me, Melissa Holmes, at 510-299-2822, or you can contact Jen King or Colleen Arnold. We would really like to answer any questions you have to make this as clear as we possibly can, to make sure that the understanding is everyone has a good understanding of what we're proposing, and so that if you have a better way to do it, we can implement that before the June bylaw changes. Thank you very much for your attention.